Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Colubrid and Colubroid Radio. I'm Zach Loafman, and we have Matt Most. The two of us make this up. How you doing, Matt?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Zach?
I'm doing well as well. It's that time of year where I have to put my teacher cap back on and stop being a field biologist, which is the fun part of the year. Not that I don't mind being a teacher, but, you know, getting paid to flip rocks and catch crawdads is kind of cool. But anyway, this is our second episode, and we have Clint Bartley with us today. And a little bit, here in a little bit, we'll be getting into a nice conversation with Clint about Asiatic rat snakes and black rat snakes and other colubrids that he keeps. But before we get into that, there's a couple little housekeeping items we need to do. On the first episode, Matt and I were so excited to record things that we kind of forgot to tell you where you can find us on social media. And obviously you want to go there if you want to keep tabs on what's going on with the podcast, because we're going to share when our episodes are up and running. So you can find me, Zach Loafman, at Facebook or on Facebook, and then Dr. Crawdad on Instagram. And then Matt, how are you doing? Where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Facebook too as well, on our business page for Sarpamitra. And you can also find us on Instagram at Sarpamitra USA. And occasionally I do post some videos with the Sarpamitra Care series on YouTube with Maggie. And between all of those different social media outlets, you can kind of connect with us in multiple different aspects, see what we're actually producing throughout the year, and see what we're up to on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, there we go. So we've had, we keep tabs with each other, and we've been crazy busy past couple weeks, but we've had a couple developments within our respective collections. I had my Japanese rat snake clutch hatch, and I tried for 4 freaking years to get those things to go. So that's a pretty big deal for me. They're not going anywhere. They're all staying with me. Earlier in the week, I had a clutch of Boiga Sienna green cat-eyed snakes. Those were hatching on Monday, and that's my first time producing those, and we still have tons of false water cobras in the incubator. I don't know how many eggs are in there. That's for school and grad student projects. I think we have about 60 eggs cooking, and we've had about 60 eggs hatch. So that, and then of course the students' projects are rocking and rolling with hognose snakes and corn snakes and everything else, barons, racers, the whole kit and caboodle. So what's up with you, Matt, on that regard?
Yesterday I got to ship you a box.
Yes, you did.
So you want to give the watchers and viewers a little heads up on what you just added to your collection?
Yes, I just added 4 Ramphiophis, so African beak snakes. Don't know the exact species. It's not the one with the eye stripe. Red beaks?
I'm pretty sure those are red spotted beaks.
Red spotted beaks,
based upon what I was able to look up on them.
And I'm excited to work with those. I have a story with those we'll talk about in a future episode if we ever talk about Ramphiophis. It's kind of fun. And then there was an added bonus in the box. One of my faves, tricolored hognose snake, was in there as well. So some wonderful rear-fanged colubroids. And I'm really looking forward to getting those going. And thank you for sending those my way. I also got today a pair of thorn scrub rats from Chris Painshab at Badlands Herp. I've never actually seen those alive before. I've of course, being the nerd that I am, I've seen them in field guides. They're in Stebbins, Reptiles and Amphibians of Western North America. But damn, those are cool. They're like incredibly light, sand-colored emery-esque rat snake. It's pretty awesome. There was also paper that just came out. They were sunk taxonomically, and then just recently, within the past 6 months, the paper came out that re-elevated them to subspecies status. So I'm really looking forward to working with those as well. So yeah, good times with me. Anything new for you?
A lot of fun to put in those cups, just because of the nature of how fast those suckers are, to put them in a little 8-ounce deli cup.
Yeah.
But other than that, hatching out some file snakes. I have 2 mandarins that were starting to lay while I was walking out the door to go to Michigan today. So
Nice.
hopefully by Friday, come back to some nice clutches there. Other than that, we're kind of finishing up the last clutches of corn snakes hatching, and looks like we'll have some cockeye, some poultry hatching too as well in the coming weeks. And it's been an exciting year across the board. Now the hard part comes is what's staying and what's going, just because
Yes.
of space limitations.
Yeah, that's always the hard part. It wasn't hard for me to decide to keep the Japanese rat snakes, but everything else, man, rough. So, like, how many holdbacks are you going to have? What, like 40, 50, 150,
I'm thinking
200?
about 60.
60? Okay, that's a
Yeah.
low number for you.
Yeah. Last
Mm-hmm.
year held back 60. This year hold back 60, and just kind of play it through and see, how different projects fluctuate. But, one of the hard parts I think most keepers have in this hobby is trying to maintain holdbacks because
Mm-hmm.
space limitations. But not only that, sometimes we get drifted away in the hobby and we lose track of what our ages of the animals are in our collection, even. That's actually been one of the problems I've had over the years. And that's why I've held back a large number of animals last year and as well as this year. And I'm sure Clint will talk about this too in terms of his keeping skills and also holdback skills too as well, because as time progresses with breeding animals continuously, you're obviously putting more stress on the animal. And it's
Mm-hmm.
just one of those things that we need to monitor, especially as keepers, that and including when you have rarer species, you want to make sure that you have those animals in the future and kind of spread out their bloodlines too amongst other serious keepers too as well.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I know with me, the falsies, they double clutch every time they lay. So my 2 big breeder girls, they dropped 60 eggs last year and 60 eggs this year, and I'm damn certain that they're not going to be bred next year. So I have holdbacks that are just coming up to breeding age that'll kind of take their place with next year's breeding, if I even breed them, because I've produced a tremendous number of those things. Just, they're very easy to breed. We'll just leave it at that.
Well, and in terms of conversation on easy to breed things like that, it's always just the recipe, right, that
Yes.
goes along with it. And obviously in a future episode, I'm sure we'll talk about some of that too with the falsies.
Yeah, 100%. Yep. So back to the beak snakes, and then we'll move on. When I opened the box, the deli cup arrangement was amazing. And I looked at that and thought, how does he still have fingers? So what was it like putting them? And then you briefly mentioned putting them in a deli cup, but like, damn, dude, that's all I have to say.
So it's interesting, just because when I was in grad school, I worked with a lot of venomous too as well, and I always have treated rear fangs just like handling a cobra. So even putting those beaks inside those delis was a bit challenging because I did hook them and lead them into the cups.
Okay.
But looking at the size of the animals, and I'm sure once you opened up their containers and they were up to temperature, they were ready to roll and get out of that container because they were packed fairly tightly, I would imagine still. And one of them is a very aggressive feeder. And the minute you open her tub, she is out of the tub itself. So in terms of putting them in, because they are sight.
Yes, they're very visually oriented.
Observational, and anyone that works with that species or any of the subspecies too as well, I mean, you'd know that they're just an amazing animal to watch and view in a terrarium setup even. But the way that they actually collectively watch the actual keeper from their actual enclosure is just amazing in itself.
Yeah, no, I'm kind of jazzed to be working with them over the next months, years, however long they're here, which is probably going to be forever because they're totally my kind of critter. So thank you.
Yeah.
One more time.
Yeah, and the tricolor is a hypo tricolor too.
Oh, sweet. Okay.
So you'll have some fun with that.
Yeah, that is a species I got a lot of experience with. But we will definitely have a tricolor episode. I'm lining up a tricolor guest that's going to it's kind of legendary in Colubrid circles. Some people probably know who it is just from that. So talking about future episodes, we had really good feedback from the first episode. So those of you who listened, thank you very much for that. We have reached out to several well-known people in the Colubrid community and Colubroid community, and several well-known people have actually reached out to us. So the future for the podcast is nothing but bright, and we're really looking forward to proceeding down the road. And on that line of thought, we'll just jump into this. Everybody ready?
Ready.
Let's go. Okay. There we go. So our guest tonight is Clint Bartley of Bartley Reptiles. It makes a whole lot of sense for Clint to be our first guest, given the relationship that Clint and Matt have. But we're going to be focusing tonight on that relationship, but mostly just on all the wonderful work that Clint has done as a Colubrid breeder. He's a rat snake guy, works with some other animals as well. Asian rats are definitely part of his forte. That's the obvious connection between Clint and Matt. But at the same time, black rat snakes, a somewhat common species that many people in herpetoculture might overlook. Tonight's episode is going to give them a tremendous amount of love, and hopefully people give them a good solid gander. And as far as North American colubrids go, they're one of the absolute best. There's localities, there's morphs, there's unique genetic mutations, and Clint and Matt have definitely done quite a bit with that, and that's the main thrust to the night's conversation. So so first question for you, Clint, is kind of the standard issue, because we are CCR, Colubrid and Colubroid Radio, we're matching and trying to do what NPR does for Colubrid. So can you give us a little bit of your background in reptiles?
Sure, absolutely. I think I started like a lot of the individuals who have been around for ages, and that's caught a snake in the backyard kind of thing. And that started a passion. I remember my first snake was a Eastern Black King snake that I happened to catch. I was 6 years old. I had it for one day. It bit me. I got scared, dropped it, lost it, and cried. Not because it bit me, but because I lost it. And that started a passion many years ago. That was over 30 years at this point, and it just continued from there. I was very lucky that while my parents were not snake enthusiasts by any means, they were very supportive of me in that particular pursuit. I think my mother always said that there was a lot worse I could have gotten into. So that's kind of how she looked at it, to support that passion. Over the years, I've always enjoyed reptiles, really, of any kind. I appreciate lizards, appreciate turtles, tortoises, caimans, you name it, but snakes have been it. That's the passion. I've had different geckos, different lizards here and there, but I always end up back to the snakes. And it's been all kinds. It has been colubrids primarily, but of course, different pythons, boas. But as we said, I think all of us that have a broad range of appreciation for the hobby, we have a certain sect that we're drawn to, that we keep coming back to, right? And that's certainly me. When it comes to colubrids, when it comes to rat snakes, in particular, they're my highlights. I will say from the age of 8 until now, so we're looking at 30 plus years, there's not been a month I have not had a snake of some sort, for that long. So I think the very first species I ever produced was black rat snakes. And that was, I think, at the age of 11, I believe. So, yeah, lots of time and lots of experience with a lot of different species.
So the black rat snakes, then, is there a nostalgia element there?
Absolutely.
Is that part of why they're there?
I would say that it's the first. So as I said, the Eastern Black King was the first snake I ever caught, and it personally from the area I live, Eastern Black Kings are my favorite local snake to find. Just I love their look. They're the most exciting. I don't want to say they're rare by any means, but they're the most rare for me to find, routinely.
Yeah.
The black rats are extremely common. Now, I'm going to call them black rats because that's what I grew up calling them. What I mean? They've been reclassified.
We can go with that.
Technically, I think they're called Midland rats, at this point. Or so black rats are what we'll call them. In my area, they're not the prettiest. We're in an intergrade area between those and grays, so they're very dirty. But the first snake that I ever kept long term was a black rat snake, and it was just a few months after that initial capture of that Eastern Black King. And so that's where I learned how to take care of a snake. I learned how easily they can escape their cage if you're not properly. I learned that black rat snake babies will eat lizards that I didn't expect when I attempted to house one with it. Little things like that, and that. So I cut my teeth on a baby black rat snake, and I've always had an appreciation for them. Truthfully, they're one of the most gentle species that, don't get me wrong, they can have their attitudes. We all know that, but they always seem to calm down, after being handled for a while. And it's one of the few that they may put up a big show, but I could grab a 5-foot adult, wild caught adult, and the chances of being bit, maybe 20%. 1 out of 5 going to bite me, but 4 out of 5 aren't. It's just a really neat species that's extremely underrated.
Excellent. So another question for you. This is an obvious question given the nature of the podcast. So why colubrids? So many different snakes out there. We're going to ask this question of everyone.
Yeah.
So go for it.
That's what's so cool about it is I love that. Okay. For example, the Asians that, we're into, they are beautiful naturally. Some of these colors, to think you would flip a rock and that's what it would look like. It's not a morph, right? It's that beautiful. But I'm not a morph snob either, where, I look at some of these different and while I enjoy albinos, I really prefer other morphs personally, because it's a variety of colors, and that and that kind of palette's just gorgeous to me. So I would say not only do I love the incredible amount of just visual representation that you see across the board, but also the dynamic of the different characteristics within the colubrid set. Meaning you can go from a leucistic, I'll say leucistic, but let's say a Texas rat snake and that kind of attitude, to a suboc, a Trans-Pecos rat snake. And those differences in, we'll call it personality, really demeanor, where you can have one that just hates everything, and then another. For me, like subocs are one of the most inquisitive species I've ever kept. They want to follow you around when you're moving and just watch you. So that's what I like. I think if you're a hardcore colubrid keeper with a variety, it makes you a better herpetoculturalist, as a whole, because you have to learn so much more than just this one species or one sect. To say the word colubrid, it encompasses so much, and so many that you'll learn a lot by keeping varieties under that flag.
Well, that's also part of the issue, I think, when people get in this discussion of colubrids, is a lot of people don't realize basically it's a lumping ground for pretty much everything else.
Absolutely.
But Clint, I've never met a mean Texas rat snake. Everyone
never, not once.
Send you some. And so, when people will say, well, how can you tell if it's a Texas rat or a black rat? Pet it. It'll tell you.
That's it's hanging off your face. It came from Texas. Yeah, on that little token, just real quick, when I was in college, I went to the Columbus Reptiles show. It's a monthly show. It's been around forever. And I was talking to a guy, and I never interacted with a Texas rat before, and it was the end of the show, and the guy was like, "You want this?" It's like, "What?" He's like, "You want this?" He didn't show it to me. It was in a bag and it just said black rat snake. I was like, "Okay." So I, took it home, drove all the way back here to West Liberty because that's where I went to school. And when I opened the bag up, I didn't know what was in the bag. And as I opened the bag, it was flying out. And I was just like, "What the hell is this thing? This isn't a black rat snake." And it had the high yellow interstitial spaces and everything. And then I read a little bit about them. I was like, "Oh yeah, that's definitely from Texas." So anyway.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm still wondering when all of the naming of different common North American species is going to go back to what we were all used to from field guides.
What we all want it to be again.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, that's a slippery slope because the genes say one thing and the phenotypes say another thing. And given the nature of taxonomy, you've got morphology people, genetics people, and yeah, but that we're not opening that Pandora's box.
No.
That's a dedicated episode in the future.
Yeah.
For shizzle.
That's like a 3-part episode.
Yes, exactly.
Hey, Clint, other than the colubrids, I mean, I've been to your house. Mm-hmm. What else encompasses your collection there?
I also work with a small group of ball pythons. When it comes to them, at one point I had a large collection of ball pythons, but I shifted back to colubrids. I tend to always do that. But I held on to things like the ultramel morph just because I enjoy that morph of ball python. So I do little projects with that. As far as colubrids in general, we mentioned rat snakes, but I work with a lot of king snakes, some corns that are my children that came from Matt. But I'm kind of running through my head now on what I got down there, but that I think would be the extent outside of colubrids right now that I work with. Just a handful of these ball python morphs. There are a few boas at my place as well. They actually belong to another individual. I think at some point boas will be in my future again when the space says it's okay. Right now the space does not say boas are okay. That would be about the extent of it.
Okay, very cool.
And space obviously is everyone's limitation when they go through the hobby itself. And I think that sometimes can dictate our keeping style and our approach to keeping too as well, whether it be caging, racks, combination of both. Clint, do you want to elaborate on your keeping skill itself and how your approach takes forward and precedent in your collection?
Yeah, I take a little bit of both sides there, cages and racks, just depending on species. And sometimes I'll go back and forth with it because learning what the species best acclimates to. And, as we've talked in the past, I think a lot of times we try to make things cookie cutter. And by we, just talking about people in general. We try to make things cookie cutter. We try, okay, I read it in the book that 80 degrees for 78 days, for you know what I mean? And you kind of check all this off, and that's not really the case. And sometimes it's not even the case within the same species. Certain individuals do better in certain setups. For example, one of the species that you and I both work with, Matt, Prasina, the green bush rat snakes. Those are one I'm still attempting to crack a higher degree of success with. Every year, I'll produce at least one, but should be producing a lot more than that. All right. And they are successful in a rack system, meaning they eat, they live, they breed, they lay. And for me, I think my issue is somewhere in incubation. And so still trying to work through that. This past year, I moved those to an arboreal cage and 2 different sets really. And now I'm working with kind of their cycling, keeping them under UV bulbs, keeping them with a heat source, even though they're an Asian species. So working with some different things to attempt to get a higher degree of success, with them. Same thing with Carinata, moving them. I've got them in racks at the moment, considering moving some of my larger adults, our larger adults, to cages, because I feel that I had a greater degree of success with some of the big ones in a cage setup. Even though when I say a rack, we're talking major tubs here that these are in at the moment. So they've got a good amount of space. But we've noticed that some of the larger Carinata, they've not produced for a couple years now. And that may be more of a feeding thing instead of a cage setup. May have just gotten too fat, really. And so, adjusting some of the feed cycles as well as prey items, trying to get a greater degree of mix, a lot more poultry in there to try to slim them down a little bit and see if that makes a difference. But to your original question, I cycle a lot with that, whether it's long cages, whether it's tall cages, whether it's a cage that's going to hold more humidity, whether it's whether it blacks out more sides. Certain racks, can give a much greater degree of shelter, so to speak, to the animal because they are dark on three sides, and some species react better to that. So for me, it's a little bit of everything. What the species needs, I try to move in that direction. And whether that's reading through books, talking to other individuals, getting online, we're not going to know it all. None of us. There's no Bible on any species, really, right?
Yep.
It's just going to be, this was the best practices for the individual who wrote that book. And so take it, learn from it, but don't be afraid to adapt and try to venture out a little further and see what success you get by making those subtle changes.
Well, and it's interesting too. I was talking to a different keeper earlier in the week, and it's funny how we organize these aspects of keeping of a rack versus cage, because at the end of the day, it's a box, essentially.
Yeah.
But we look at these different aspects of, lighting, heat, humidity, and even though it's a box, you'd be having different success of monitoring humidity in that respective box because of ventilation or lack of ventilation even. And it's important to kind of play cues with those boxes to maximize the performance of the animal.
Absolutely. You bring up an interesting point that was a big thing for me this particular year, and that's ventilation. And it started with, I've had some decent success with subox over the years. However, I have noticed a higher mortality rate in some of my adults in that particular species. And, you read and you hear the number one cause of death when it comes to a Trans-Pecos rat snake is humidity. It needs better. And I had them in rack systems, and I felt that they were ventilated enough. Even using some of the commercial rack systems that come with ventilation already pre-made. So I thought the humidity was low enough, but I was like, you know what? I've got to change something because I continue to have this issue, right? And I probably increased my ventilation by 800% from where it was. I mean, that's not an exageration. Yeah. I'm, whole crazy on this thing, right?
Yeah.
And I
get this green box.
Yeah. So here I am with my soldering gun, just pop, 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 for hours. And I did that early in this season, and I have found it to have completely turned the tide on my success with them. Had more clutches of subox this year. All the adults seem to be doing fantastic, because babies, no problem, but the adults are where I would start to notice this. And because of that, I got to thinking just about ventilation as a whole for everything I'm working with. Yeah. And I think that we tend to not want to create so many ventilation holes because we want to hold humidity for some species. But at the same time, I'm thinking that's probably a little dangerous because the less ventilation, the more everything in there is stewing, right? The more everything bad for them is growing in that environment. We may spot clean, but that little piece of feces that is still clinging to that damp piece of cypress mulch, the bacteria, everything else that's
Yeah.
growing on it. So I actually have gone through, and it's a large collection, so I'm not through all of it, but I would say about 75% of my racks that don't come pre-ventilated already, I did the same thing to, regardless of species, where I increased the ventilation a good 800%, including a lot of the Asian species that we want to keep higher humidity on. The only thing I've changed then after increasing the ventilation was always ensuring that their moist hide box stays moist, because it's real easy with a large collection to it'll be okay, or they're not shedding, okay, I can mist it next week kind of thing. So making sure that stayed good and humid, giving them an occasional misting, maybe once a week, just over the entire tub, light misting, of course. But I think that ventilation is something we commonly forget about. We think about the size of the tub, what bedding they're on, and that kind of thing. But just to have clean airflow coming through is a big deal that most of us skimp on, in my belief.
On that token, I actually have a good example of where you would think the animal needed humidity and it led to a death. Back in 2019, I think, or 18 is when the infamous West Liberty crypto disaster happened. And at the time that we were dealing with that in one lab, we had some Laticinctus. Are they broad-banded bamboo rat snakes?
Yes.
That's common name?
Yes.
Okay. And we had those in a completely different room, like totally separate from the crypto. And they weren't doing great, which was weird because they were doing wonderful. And then they just started to kind of peter away. And then kind of serendipitously, right before we were sending a bunch of snakes to the University of Georgia for pathology that had crypto to confirm we had crypto, the Laticinctus passed. And so I had them in tubs with sphagnum moss and orchid bark substrate that was damp but not wet, kind of the classic way many people think you should keep them. And I thought, all right, well, we'll just throw them in the box and see why they died, because it could be crypto lurking in this room too. And all the other pathology came back, of course, as cryptosporidium. But what was really interesting is those Laticinctus had actually died, and they did a complete necropsy of the animal. But they had a fungus that had basically gotten into their lungs and had manifested itself and taken out all the little alveoli, the little structures that you use for oxygen. And nobody ever talks about that. And that's totally 100% resultant of lack of ventilation. So we did the same thing you did, Clint, and bought a soldering iron and made a lot of holes.
Well, and that's the kind of thing where, in most cases, myself included, if I would have found that animal, I would have just thought it's one of those things. You deal with life, you deal with death. Sometimes you come in and there's just a dead snake. I mean, there's really always a reason, but we don't go through the additional steps to take to find out exactly what happened, like you did. So that's interesting, because I mean, that probably happens more out there than any of us are aware. There may have been something that the snake was carrying internally from birth that just finally, that it ruptured today. It was its time. But I would say my guess is 90% or more of the deaths that we come across that just happen are something in the keeper's error.
Yeah.
Well, and even with that even being said, sometimes you'll hear keepers talking about respiratory infections, and right away they go to treat it with antibiotics. And it's likely not even a respiratory infection. It has to do with lack of humidity or too much humidity.
Environmental.
And really what we're doing is basically creating resistant strains within those animals. So this way, when we go to actually treat for that respiratory infection, it won't be successfully treated. Even Clint, I remember when you and I purchased the same racks, my basement at my old house was like a rainforest. It was like 70% humidity in there. And I kept complaining to Clint. I'm like, man, I need to like put more ear holes in there. So I got like a 5/8 drill hole and drilling all these brand new racks.
It was so funny because Matt kept saying that to me. He's like, man, it's just, I've got like condensation and all this inside. And I'm thinking, man, I'm having like, I'm dealing with some stuck sheds, here and there. I'm like, how are you? I don't get it, man. No, I don't need to drill any more holes in here. What are you talking about? But then we finally put together that his basement was like over 70%. The humidity level was over 70% in his basement, where in mine it was 40. I'm like, well, there it is. Yeah. It's raining in your basement, Matt.
There you go. Yeah, there's something about my house. I had a bunch of Asian rats until April or May, but they just didn't. There's something about my setups environmentally, because I know my cages are good, my temps are good, because other things are thriving. But I just basically threw in the towel because something was just off there. But other animals, like my dipsadids and these garter snakes I've gotten, and water snakes and king snakes, they're all like thriving there. There was just something weird when it came to Asiatic rat snakes. They just didn't jive. I don't know what the hell is going on. Some bad juju. But that speaks to something that I tell the zoo-size students here all the time. In fact, I told some of them this week, is that it's the forest through the trees statement. You can't just rinse, recycle, repeat. You've got to learn your space and your quirks, and then understand that your space and your quirks are your space. That may not be somebody else's space. And that one of the things that drives, I'm sure, all of us crazy is you see somebody who's asking a question on social media, and then somebody flames them and says, this is wrong. This is, blah, blah, blah. You don't know that when you're saying that to that person who's in Texas and you're in Florida. Those are, even Texas. If you're in East Texas, it's a swamp. If you're in West Texas, it's a desert. Yes. You've got completely different background humidity and temperature levels, and barometric pressure, storm front, all that kind of stuff plays in. So
it's, and some of the things that are wild with that, like two stories I could say, along what you just mentioned there about, kind of your space and what works and what doesn't work. Sometimes even species that you would think have the exact same care, and they really do. Matt has heard me say this time and time again. I can produce coxeye like crazy. I can produce Pulcher like crazy. I can produce Laticinctus like crazy. But I am where Volante come to die. So that's I have had the worst luck with them. I mean, it doesn't matter where I get them. It doesn't matter if I've raised them from babies. I finally have produced one, and it's in my house, and it's going to Matt's as soon as I come up there. So that thing doesn't die. But I mean, and we're talking about they've been kept in the same racks as all the other Porphyraceae, and they're, everything else is fine, but I don't know what I'm doing wrong with them, and I cannot figure it out. So I've been able to check them off my list as I've produced them. That feather is in my cap. Now they can go to Matt, and he can play with them, and he can take care of them because I just killed him for some reason. But and another funny kind of just quirk when it comes to snakes is ball pythons. A good friend of mine is local as well to me, Brandon Osborne of Osborne Reptiles. He's famous for the urban camo ball python, and he and I we do different projects together as well. And over the years, there have been times one of us has had a ball python that, okay, we're on month 4 and it's still not eating. Why don't you take this over to your place and try? And literally, it's happened both ways, where one of us will leave the other one's house, have this ball python in a bag, go home, put it in a tub, drop a rat in, and it eats it immediately. Strikes and does it immediately. So, I mean, it's like you've got all the same kind of setups and all this, but for some reason, just moving from one space to another has suddenly kicked it into, its more natural instincts. So it's crazy. It's wild what we we see out there. There's no one size fits all, for sure. There's no one answer for everybody.
Yep. Absolutely. So you mentioned giving that snake to Matt. So you guys obviously have a relationship going on. Can you kind of give the origin story to how you two started working together, found each
Yeah,
other?
absolutely. Yeah. Matt
This
sold me a
sounds like a
snake that
weird
was wrong.
romance I'm setting up here. Anyway,
So
there we
I
go.
would say the way Matt and I met was I was just getting into Asians. I say just I'd had cockeye for a couple years, and I was growing that particular collection. And Matt had a cockeye for sale, a male, or so he thought. And and Matt lives about 3 hours away from me. And so we decided to just kind of meet in the middle. And so we talked for a good 10, 15, 20 minutes until, Matt was told he had to leave by his partner at the time there. And then
At that bar we met at, I could spit on the ground and no one had any shame. No one looked at me any poorly at that place.
There you go. My kind of place.
I don't even know if they had floors in that place, to be honest. Now that I'm there.
But we obviously stayed in touch, because we had this similar interest, and I was growing more and more what I was learning about and wanting out of just Asians. I mean, it was a brand new section of this hobby that still to this day is pretty underrepresented in the United States. It's certainly it's grown exponentially from where it was 15 years ago, but still in the grand scheme of things, it's low. It's low. And Matt is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to Asians. So he was able to introduce me to so much. I was able to bounce questions off of him. Bought an endless amount of snakes from him, over the years now. And from that, we started to kind of we realized, one, we enjoyed each other. We kind of had similar goals, similar interest, and similar philosophies, which I think was one of the most important pieces for being able to do projects together, is just the philosophy on it all, where it wasn't about the money of what we were producing. If we made a few bucks, fantastic, but that's not what we were about. We also knew that animals die. It does happen, unexpectedly. And sometimes those could be cheap animals. Sometimes they could be expensive animals. It happens, especially with some of what we wanted to work with. As we started doing projects, we're dealing with things that aren't incredibly common, and there's not a lot of information out there on them. So we were learning as we were going with some of this, and Matt will be able to talk about some of that too. And eventually, as Matt was obviously helping me learn a lot on the Asian side, the black rat interest had sparked for me. There were some somewhere in Europe. Matt will be able to remember exactly where some of these morphs were. That I've always liked black rats, and I felt that there was going to be a wave coming with them. Looking at the morphs, looking at the direction of the hobby as a whole, I felt it was going to be a great time to jump back into them. I wanted to I had some, I've never not had a black rat snake, but it was going to be a good time to really take on some projects when it came to black rat snakes.
Gotcha.
Expand it. And so I said something to him, and at first he's kind of thinking, black rat snakes, really? And I'm, Matt, yeah, let's look into this, reach out. Let's see about getting some of this sent over here. And, he looked at some of the pictures, and I think he saw what I saw at that point, that's going to be a popular animal, and it's going to be fun to work with, especially when we start getting it into some of the things that, we already had our hands on over here. So I think that was the first black rat project that Matt and I did together. was getting a handful of
Yeah,
hypo
I think what was
lavender.
it? Yep.
Yep,
Yeah,
hypo
from
lavenders,
Iman
hypo het
in
lavenders.
Germany.
Yeah, we got a group. Was it Germany they came from? We got a group of those sent over, and from there, it kind of exploded for us. I mean, we began getting our
Gotcha.
hands on really every black rat morph there is that has been proven out so far. There's a couple out there that might be proven out this year. We'll see. And I'm talking to some of the individuals working with them, and it exploded really for us. I think that not only the amount of animals we had, we got our hands on some that are extremely hard to find right now. Brindles, for example, which is and you hear this story over and over and over from so many. I had those in the 90s, and there's so much of that out there. And with black rats, it's very true. I had brindles back in the 90s. You cannot find them today, for sale. So doing that, we've grown. We also do Carinata together. There's a lot of species that even if it's not a project that we co-own, we both have, and so we communicate on those quite a bit. Bella japonesis would be, one of those. But the black rat specifically is kind of what catapulted our partnership on projects, and it's bared some nice fruit for us because just this year, through a project we set out for, I think 3 years ago, we were able to produce for the very first time in the world that I know of a hypo calico black rat snake. And I do know for a fact the first time in the world we created at least 2, maybe even 3, as I'm looking at them, hypo lavender calico black rat snakes. And
we beat the Europeans.
That's right. That's right.
That's what matters, I guess.
So, and that's exciting.
That's cool.
I mean, and what I love about that project is who knows what it's actually going to look like. I know what this baby looks like right now, but it's going to look completely different in 6 months, in a year, in 2 years. So things like that are incredibly exciting, and that's really why I think black rats have been such a passion for me, certainly. And I know Matt gets excited about them too. I mean, if you think about it, we're talking about. I'm going to go off on a tangent here when it comes to kind of these genetics and these mutations.
Yeah.
You're talking about one of, if not the most commonly found species in the United States, in North America, right? I mean, they're everywhere, all over the place. Now, and it's regardless of what you're calling them today, right? They're all over the place. And there is such variance in just the way they naturally occur. You can find them in the same area, and you're talking everywhere from a jet black snake to brown saddles on a gray background, right? And every shade in between. And so what I find, I don't know if the word comical is right, but intriguing and interesting is the most common snake that we come across is one of the most difficult when it comes to identifying morph and what you actually have and are working with that I've ever experienced or encountered. Because
that's interesting.
You can have, and I think a lot of it may come from mislabeling over the years as well. When you're dealing with hypos, and at this point, I feel that there's more than one line, at least 2 lines of hypos. They're probably compatible. You're dealing with amel. And I think that we're dealing with multiple lines of amel, because if you'll hear red line, you'll hear white line, yellow line, things like that. And they very well may be completely different lines, but happen to be compatible. Or we're just dealing with different localities expressing the amel or the hypo in different ways, because there's different amount of pigmentation that comes with that locality. And then, of course, as babies, they all look alike. It's whether it's hypo, amel, even chocolate, which we deal with. They're so similar that if you begin crossing and combining these different mutations and traits, if you sell something as a hatchling, you're giving it your best guess a lot of times at what that visual animal truly is. Because it may be 6 months before you can really think about, okay, that does look more like this than that. And then when you get to things like eye pigment as a determination on is it hypo, is it amel, it's incredibly confusing. And I think the waters were muddied long before Matt and I ever got into it. So there are certain animals we're still trying to figure out what we have. Another example, I know that we've got a pair of at least hypo rusty black rat snakes, but they may be hypo amel rusty black rat snakes. Look completely different than anything else. And truthfully, I'm not going to know what the hell those are until we breed them to something else. So, but it is a project that can go on for years and still not fully have all the answers yet. And that kind of excites me.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
On something so common. Common. But
I remember when Clint and I went down a road. Sorry. Go ahead, Clint.
I was going to say I was
going to talk about. Now we're just talking over each other.
I think we have a delay.
No, I was going to say, even when we started working with the leucistic black rats, and there was the conversation of rusties and leucistics, and then some rusties can produce leucistics, but some can't. And it's like, how does that work?
Yeah.
Well, for someone unfamiliar with black rat snakes, as far as their morphs are concerned, could you do like a quick rundown of what the different morphs are and what the phenotype is expressed as?
Kind of see if I can do this off the top of my head, right? On what I remember.
There you go.
So you have calico, which is a pattern and color mutation at the same time. It's one of those rare, unlike any other mutation kind of look that you'll ever see. You have hypomelanistic, and again, I think there may be more than one line of hypo out there. And I'll talk more about that on some other morphs in a second. You have amel or albino. I know that's not technically interchangeable, but in the hobby it is. Then you have things like chocolates, which I actually think is another form of hypo, but not nearly closely related to the common form. The common form of hypo creates like a orangish red animal, where the chocolate literally looks like milk chocolate, as adults. But I think even that is still a form of hypo, on the black. Lightning is a brand new morph that Matt and I have as well. And the original animal was caught in Arkansas, if I remember right. And we got some heads and visuals from the individual who caught the original morph, as well as he went and caught some females in the same locality. And that's what he started the project with. Scott, who, great guy to chat with too. So, but the lightning, I mean, it's not identical by any means, but it looks very similar to the chocolates. Enough where that will be a test breeding that we end up doing down the line to see if is it the same thing? Is it compatible, or is it nothing, not allele at all? But that's a newer morph that is pretty neat out there. Lavender, which in itself is causing some confusion, I believe, in the hobby. The original lavender, I don't have the origin story, but if you find pictures of them, adults will be a black rat snake that has almost a purple or lavender undertone in the background color. So, I mean, it's enough where you can see that it's different. However, I've been hearing the terms lavender and European lavender thrown around a lot. And unless there's two lines that I'm not familiar with, the pictures I'm seeing of what people are calling European lavenders are hypolavenders. And that's a very purple snake, a purple pinkish snake. Um, and again, that's something, if there's someone who listens to this and wants to correct me on that with origin stories, please. I'm always up to learning. But from the pictures I'm seeing, I think there's some confusion. And in fact, I mean, Matt and I could say our lavenders came from Europe, European line, right? So, and I think that that's actually what's probably happened is some of those have come over, because I know that Iman, if I'm saying his name right, was shipping some of those to others as well. And I think that's where that term came from. And they actually have a double recessive animal, not a single recessive, not a lavender. A lavender is a single recessive gene. In fact, this year was the first year we produced visual lavenders that weren't a combination of hypo, and that was part of the triple het by triple het pairing that we were using that created the hypo lavender calico. You know, we kind of had the whole gamut of morphs that came out of those two clutches.
Just muddying it up.
Right. There is also white sides, the white side of black rat snakes. Rusties, that's going to get us into kind of the Lucy talk. And so some of this I'll say I know, and then I'll give some theory. And I'll make sure to point out which is which, right? So there are, to my understanding, two lines of leucistic black rat snakes. There is a recessive line that I believe started, it almost sounds like the majority of morphs from black rat snakes started in Ohio. That's so many come from Ohio. But there was a recessive gene that came out of Ohio, and I believe we would call, I guess, incomplete dominance would be the technical term, but in the hobby, codom is what everybody likes to call it. There's a leucistic version of that as well. And in that particular line, you have the incomplete dominant is called rusty, which we could kind of call it, if we wanted to explain to others, as a het leucistic is a rusty. You know, if we wanted to say it like that, I know that's not accurate, but a rusty is a kind of a lighter brown, washed out black rat snake. And then when you breed a rusty to rusty together, you've got a 25% chance of each egg being a leucistic. And so you have those two different lines. Now, where I think it gets muddy for black rats, really as a whole and everything, but specifically leucistics, I think that there have been confusion over the years on the recessive gene leucistic black rat and the recessive gene leucistic Texas rat. And those have been muddied, bred together. And I had, you know, in the past, I've had some that were supposed to be the het leucistic black rats. I just wasn't confident enough in it for me to continue with that project, because it very well could have been, but I just didn't know. And when it comes to our black rats, I want to know that that's what we're working with, are the black rats. Even though, again, like the calico could be considered an intergrade because of where it originated from, which was just about an hour and a half from where I live. It originated over in Kentucky. And even over there, that's a Midland, you know, rat snake, as they're called now. So some people can argue that the calico would fall under a gray, you know, morph, not just a solid black morph. I disagree with that statement. And at this point, we just kind of have to accept it as it's a black rat snake morph. It's almost like you hear the term hobby Honduran, because there's no true Honduran milk snakes in the hobby. Yeah, but okay, you know, we have to move from that, because this is what the hobby considers Hondurans at this point, you know, and it's moved to that. But yeah, so that the het leucistics, those I wanted to move away from, because I didn't feel comfortable saying that that's what they were, because I didn't
their origin.
You know, I just didn't know it for
sure.
And brindles, that's another morph of black rat snake. And it's an obvious morph. When you combine it with other things, it may not be as much, but in and itself is another unique pattern and color mutation at the same time. That, as I mentioned, has kind of disappeared throughout the hobby. And we've got, we work with it. We actually just produced some hets that we will be holding several back to be able to expand on that morph and try to get it repopulated in the hobby, really. That's one I get asked for quite a bit. I'm pretty sure I would say a lemon would be a gray rat snake morph, not black rat snake morph, although it gets dumped into that pretty commonly. But that would be something that we will probably keep separate, so that if for those that feel that yes, that's 100% a gray rat snake morph, okay, I'll agree with you there, and we won't be mixing that. I like to keep that separate. Man, am I forgetting any? I'm trying to I'm going through racks in my head right now to see on the opening drawers what's in that one, kind of thing.
You mentioned already the white sides, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's really the only one that I was familiar with before today. And I've seen, and I don't know if this is just a colloquial term for a morph you've already thrown out there, but moonshine rat.
The moonshine is actually I believe it's a T positive, which the lightning might be a T positive in the black rat snakes as well, if not a form of hypo. The chocolates could be T positive, but I digress. I apologize. The moonshines are a locality specific morph of the natural occurring intergrade between the black and yellow rat snake out of Horry County, South Carolina. And so it's commonly called the greenish rat snake is what that intergrade is called. It's the moonshine is a locality specific, and I certainly hope anyone, if you're hearing this, if you work with moonshines, keep it locality specific. Don't mix that into black rats, because then we've got yellow rat mixed into these other mutations, and that just muddies the water. You might as well call it a bubble gum, because that's the generic term that has kind of been put on any of the rat snakes that have been mixed and matched and all this with different color mutations across grays, blacks, yellows, everglades, all those. It's just labeled bubblegum. So, yes, so I work with moonshines as well. It is a beautiful morph. I mean, they are stunning, and it's neat that that comes from a natural intergrade area. So. But yeah, it's got black rat in it, but I wouldn't say is a complete black rat morph.
So if we were to jump a little bit into care of black rat snakes, I've kept black rat snakes here in West Virginia. Like you said, that's, it's kind of funny because they're common, but like after May, you'll see one crossing the road maybe once every 3 months, unless you go out and start flipping tin like it's your job. But so we all have kept them. But do you notice there being any kind of difference in husbandry between the rat snakes versus corn snakes? Because everybody talks about how corn snakes are kind of the classic beginner colubrid, and obviously black rats get significantly larger than corns and come out of the egg bigger than a corn. But is the care the same? Is it different? Are there any little nuggets
I was actually going to say that, in my opinion, black rat snake care is corn snake care, but a little bigger. A little bit bigger space, because they are so incredibly similar. I would venture to say you have a lower percentage of babies that refuse to feed right off the bat.
Okay.
I just realized I didn't plug in my laptop, gentlemen, and so we better do that.
Yeah.
So,
pause.
Yeah.
1 second, everyone. I apologize for this technical delay here.
All I'm thinking about is when Clint's talking about crossing some of these adults, I'm like, well, now I just opened up another tub at my house, since some of those are raise ups that are at my house, and then I'm just wondering what Clint's going to fill it with a holdback.
Absolutely. I think as Matt and I, well, before I go back into that, so the overall care, I think one advantage too that when we talk about beginner species that a black rat has is being that it is so common throughout the U.S. that just our natural humidity in most areas,
Yep.
the natural light cycles, I mean, the natural temperatures that we have is usually pretty conducive to keep them happy and healthy. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that, same thing, as long as they are ventilated, they don't need extreme humidity, but they will have a shed problem if they don't have an area to get humid when they need it. Um, they're easy. They're very easy. Give them a warm side of around 80, cool side of around room temperature, and those things will thrive. I mean, they absolutely will. And I think that being that they do get larger, but they get size on them a little bit quicker than corn snakes, probably make them an even
Mm-hmm.
better beginner species for someone young because, in my opinion, a little bit of weight, girth, and size on a snake is better for someone who isn't as familiar with handling. They're less likely to hurt the
Yeah.
animal. And they calm
It's
down just as easily as, if anything, I mean, a lot of times baby corn snakes seem to be a little bit more nippy than what a baby black rat snake does. For me.
and if they put on size, they also become less of a security risk of finding a 1 millimeter hole, and then you think, oh, that thing can't get out of there, and boom, gone. I've actually had that happen here in the past month. I had a clutch of Slowinski's rat snakes, which used to be, they're basically MRI, the same size as a corn snake, and I had them in a Rubbermaid locking tub in my office, and the guy down the hallway is like, yo, one of your friends is down here. And like, come down, and like, how the hell did that get out of there? And then someone found one in a garbage can. Someone found one like in the stairwell. It's like, I don't understand. These are literally the tubs we put the babies in, like, because they don't escape. And that's basically size-wise the same thing as a corn snake. So anything that's going to get bigger than that little worm faster, you're going to be able to maintain it and lose that risk of it escaping. So
and I would say to anybody that's looking at black rats that wants to have a very natural looking setup,
mm-hmm.
if you set up something arboreal for a black rat snake, it's going to use every bit of it. They're pretty neat display animals because they do have that size. They're fairly active and they will use every bit of the cage. So.
Very
Clint,
cool.
Going back to even your comment about how they're so widespread throughout the United States, I think that's actually part of the reason why sometimes we're not able to produce some of these different colubrids in captivity. You're going to see different success rates throughout different geographical areas just based upon natural causes like barometric pressure or humidity, light cycles. So I think in terms of even talking about black rat snakes, I wouldn't say this very openly, but I would say they're more forgiving too as well.
Absolutely.
And
you can screw up a lot and they still live. I mean, that's absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's whenever you can cut your teeth on wild caught animals, as a kid, and I mean, especially back then, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have all this to be able to research and learn. And I mean, honestly, I should have killed a lot of black rat snakes, thinking back on that back then, but they never did, that they were hardy. And, like right now, like I said earlier with the Volante, I do all the research possible. I ask all the questions I can, and I'm still not having luck. But the black rats, yeah, they just, I mean, they're garbage disposals. They, eat anything you throw at them, and they just keep on ticking. They're strong species. They're hardy. There's even a joke because we talked about how widespread they are. I think all of us that deal with snakes, we inevitably, when snake season comes around, we're getting tagged constantly on social media. What is this? What is this?
Yep.
What is this? Right? And I had another friend because I'm tagged all the time on it, and the answer, I think only twice have I ever answered anything other than black rat snake, harmless.
Yeah.
Black rat snake, harmless. And so I had a friend comment once, do you ever get tired of saying black rat snake? Because he sees all these I get tagged in. And I said, you know what the funny thing is? My phone auto-populates it. If I say BL, I just tap, 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 black rat snake, boom, boom, boom.
Yeah.
Because I've tapped it so many times, as an explanation, because they're so common. And this is, again, going to be one of those kind of tangent things, but I find it an interesting thought. We talked earlier about the variance in the natural occurring variance in this animal, and I say that because the thought of them being spread all over the country and all that has.
Yep.
Sometimes I wonder how many more morphs there are that we don't realize. I mean, when you think about ball pythons, that can't be the only species that has 9,000 base morphs, right? Every little crooked piece is something different. And I do think that while this species has a huge variance in just the way it naturally looks, I believe there's more genetic mutations that we just don't realize that that's what it is. Sometimes we chalk it up to natural variance from one spot to another, unless it significantly stands out. Like I said, when you go from a jet black animal to, some of what we have in our collection that is a multi-het animal, literally brown saddles on gray background as adults. There's more there. I just think that there's not been enough financial incentive for people to go out there and figure it out, truthfully.
One of the interesting things is, if you, on that line of thought, is when you talk about a population that has a lot of different colorations from a biological point of view, we refer to that as phenotypic plasticity. And all the kind of stalwarts for the old taxonomy and all the different subspecies that were subsequently in the early 2000s eliminated by the Berbrink paper. What you don't realize is what the Berbrink paper is saying is exactly what you just said, which is basically that the fact that the yellow rat snake and the gray rat snake and a black rat snake all share similar genetics shows you that this population, if you identify them as a genetic species, which is what you're doing if you honor that newer system, is that it's naturally built into the animal to basically express phenotypes that are responsive to the environments that they're in. And so, while I understand the people that are totally on board for maintaining, like Rosalini, the Everglades rat snake, and get all upset, and trust me, I was upset when I read that paper way back when. If you're looking at this from a perspective of I want to create different phenotypes and things like that, what the gene flow in the species shows based off that paper is that this species is basically one continuous population with localized geographic variance, which is exactly what the origins for these morphs are. It's just a stronger form of, it's legitimate albinism and things like that. But to take a black rat snake and make it a yellow rat snake, you are decreasing melanin. So that whole process is going on, and you are expressing Xander-based, yellow-based pigments and things of that nature. I said we weren't going to talk about this, but we have to just a little bit. So the big issue scientifically with that paper that came out, that basically came up with these three species that a lot of people have, is when you read the paper, it was the actual collecting, it was the field work that was done to get the genetics to represent these different populations to then carve it up was kind of spotty and localized, and some of the geographic features of North America that were used to differentiate the taxa just do not really hold water. It was literally water. In one case, there's this argument that like rivers, like I think the Mississippi River was an important barrier to gene flow. And I personally have been in the middle of Lake Jordan in North Carolina with my uncle back when I was 10. And here comes a black rat snake right across the middle of the lake. So, that's not really going to stop it. But anyway, that's just a fun little bit of biology that you can kind of throw into that mix. So yes, you're certainly correct. And if you look at like the North American field herping forums, or even just statewide snake groups on social media where you get the general public involved, and they'll post up a picture like, what's this pink snake? I don't know what group it was, but there was definitely a pink black rat snake posted up in one of those groups this year, and Lord knows what would have happened if that would have gotten into the hands of a herpetoculturist. So
Absolutely.
yeah. So along that same line of care, if we were to jump into breeding, what when you're dealing with these different morphs and the origins of them, if you have a morph that originated in Arkansas and you have a morph that originated in northern or central Ohio, climatically, like those two areas are going to receive different winter seasons, different fall seasons. When it comes to actually doing the whole rinse, recycle, repeat to colubrid breeding, especially North American colubrids, where you basically begin to cool them in the fall, then drop them down to a certain temperature, and then warm them back up in the spring to initiate that reproductive aspect of their biology. Do you have to do that with these animals, or do they? Can you food cycle them? Like, what is your actual process for producing a black rat snake?
I don't want to say that you have to. I will say that I do. That would be the best way for me to answer that. It goes back to my belief that there are always several different ways to be successful, when taking care of an animal of any type. So I always premise it by saying, this is how I do it. And I don't mean that as I do it right. I'm saying this is what I do, and this is the particular level of success I've had by doing it this way, if that makes sense. With black rats, what I found is really regardless of where they have originated, usually within a year, they will have acclimated to where they're at, now. So, if I was to get, let's say, a male that I want to breed, in fact, I will say, and I'm going to use this example with a Texas rat because it happened to be that, but falls in the same lines really on care and cycling. I got a adult leucistic Texas rat male at the end of a cycle, going into a winter. And so he hadn't been with me long enough where, he was healthy, a few meals in him, all that, and then went ahead and cycled him. Didn't produce, or actually very poorly. Got bad eggs from multiple females that he was put to that season. He went through the entire season with me, went through the next cycling through the winter. This year, I've got how many I tell you, Matt? 60 leucistic eggs, something like that. So I think, they would normally get into the cycle of whatever season, not whatever season, but whatever region that they're now in, usually within a year, because if they weren't as adaptive as they are, they wouldn't be as prevalent across the entire U.S., as they are. So it's a very easy species to cycle. I will say I have found that with a lot of colubrids, and maybe this has changed since I was a kid and hearing it, but they say 2 years. At 2 years old, they can usually start breeding. With black rats, that's probably true, but most don't, in my opinion. Instead, it's that 3-year mark before they really want to, and that male or female. They can certainly go younger. I've had some of them do it, but it's usually about 3 years before I'm getting action at all from them. And in fact, this year I've experienced the same thing with the moonshines. Moonshines tend to get bigger faster than black rats. I don't know if it's just some of that, the vigor of having the cross there, but the babies grow a little faster, and my adults are bigger. They're some of the biggest, rat snakes I've got. But same thing. They're at 2 years old. They're as big as some of the 3-year-old black rats.
That's cool.
But they didn't go for me this year. Some of the holdbacks. And so I'm thinking, okay, they're probably same thing, that they do much better at year 3, for breeding. So anyone who's looking at breeding them, I would probably just go ahead and wait until your 3rd year before I'd even attempt it. Because even if you get eggs in year 2, it's probably not going to be anything really worth putting that female through that cycle yet. So year 3, even year 4 is when they really start to do well. This year in particular, our white sides, I think we've had something like 76 white side black rat snake eggs I mean, just cranking. But that's typical. I do the same thing, and maybe I do it just because it's how we were told when we were young. I typically try to wait until they shed. The female has her first shed post brumation, and then I put them together. Sometimes I'll put them together before just because I'm curious to see what happens. Because with Asians, they'll breed like that, at certain ones. Hell, I've not even warmed them up yet, and at all, and put them together, and they'll start locking up. But I don't really see it out of the North American. I think that a lot of that information we got when we were young was probably based off of North American species. The whole wait for that first shed, then pair.
Yep.
That recipe seems to work very well with them. But I've seen that there's sometimes a female will come out of brumation and she won't shed for a while. It's not as common, but I mean, we're talking if I'm going on week 7, week 8, and she still hasn't shed yet, I go ahead and start pairing her because she may be ovulating or starting that cycle and just for some reason hasn't shed. And we've had success with that as well. I'll also say
there is a
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I also
go
think
for it,
that typically you have there are other species you can see visual locks, but then not produce. I have not experienced that with black rats. If they lock, you're probably going to get eggs. It's almost a guaranteed kind of thing. Whether or not they're good, you'll see. But if they lock, she's probably going to lay.
Yeah, with most North American true colubrids, that's the rat snakes, milk snakes, pits, that post brumation shed is actually associated with the release of pheromones that basically tells the boys, yo, I'm ready. We had a corn snake here last year, not this year, but last year, and she came out of brumation, and we basically put a male with her because we needed eggs for a project, and the male didn't really show much interest. She was out of brumation 9 weeks before she shed, and she was shedding, and he was trying to lock with her. Like the shed wasn't even off her body yet, but up until that point, it was really no interest, and that's because there's the pheromone release and all that kind of good stuff. Because there's some aspects of the production of eggs that are associated with that brumation shed. So,
I think at one point weren't they even considering that part of the trailing behavior?
Yes.
Of
yeah, that's some cool snake biology for everybody. So we've talked about babies. We've talked about your process of brumation. We've talked about the morphs. We've talked about care. Final question just has to deal with eggs. I mean, obviously, these things live where most of the people listening live, at least if you're in the eastern part of the country. I remember, I don't know if it was the first clutch of eggs. I think it was the second clutch of eggs I incubated personally way back when. I caught a gravid rat snake and kept her till she dropped. And all I did was literally put them in, I think it was a pickle jar. And this is very primitive. Put some sphagnum moss in there and put them in my parents' garage. And that was my brumation, my incubation strategy. And every single egg freaking hatched.
Yeah.
Is that true, or do some of these morphs have is there deleterious gene pairings? You don't breed this with that because you're not going to get progeny from it. Can we talk just a little? I know there's more facets there than just one, but maybe we can just cover that and then we can.
With black rat snakes, nothing I've experienced like that so far.
Okay.
But I think that you don't see as many black rat snake combos as you would think with as long as, all these mutations have been out there. So, that may be something we come across as we continue to mix and match and see what happens. To go into the question on incubation, first I'll back up one step, just for those who are listening, wanting to do this. When cycling, I typically will drop my temperatures over about a 2-week period. I stop feeding completely, let them get about 2 weeks to flush out. Then over a 2-week period, I start dropping my temperatures from a warm spot of about 80 getting down to eventually, I try to target 55 to 58 degrees. And for those listening, if you don't get them that low and they're a little higher, like the 63 to 65, that to me, that's more dangerous than keeping them up or getting them all the way down because it's almost like their immune systems aren't completely shut down. They're not shut down, but their immune systems are weakened. So you're more likely to get sick animals. So you really want to try to target that kind of 55, 58 degree range. Keep them there for as little as 8 weeks, but it depends on how much vacation I want from all the snakes sometimes.
Yep, I hear you.
So,
been there, done that.
Yeah, so that might stretch, a little more, but at least an 8-week minimum. It just sometimes I'm chomping at the bit to get them warmed up and start, fooling around with them again. Sometimes I'm like, I'm not ready for this yet. So I'd say 8, no more than 12. Really, that's going to be plenty. I warm up over the course of a week. It doesn't really seem to phase anything. So I'll bump it up to 65 on day 1. About day 3 or 4, I'll bump it up to 70, 74. And then eventually I'll get their warm side up to 80 by the end of the week. And then I'll give them, at that point, just watch their behavior. If they're not really active, I don't try to feed them right off the bat. But usually by week 2, they're ready. They're going back at it. So just wanted to give some of those temperature and timing.
No, that's great
for those that are interested. Then after breeding, I kind of watch her, and once she goes through that shed, that pre-lay shed, you've got about 10 days. And sometimes it's like clockwork with them. 10 days and they drop. I'd say anywhere between 7 to 10, but usually it's about 10 days, and they're going to drop them off for you. And then, this for some I think is controversial, but if you have a very well-fed animal, in my experience, they will double clutch whether you want them to or not. And meaning, even if you don't put a female with a male, so often I would get a second clutch, and I would get a higher number of infertile eggs. And I think it's because she wasn't paired. And so I finally come to the conclusion that if a female is heavy bodied and extremely healthy, I go ahead and I partner her within about a week of her laying that first clutch, because if she's going to put her body through that second cycle, I at least try to attempt to make as many of the eggs viable as possible. So she's not putting herself through that strenuous activity without there really being fruit of her labor, so to speak. Now, with that in mind, when a female lays, I'll pull the eggs to incubate, and I attempt to feed her within 24 hours of her laying. If she doesn't want it, no problem. But most of the time, they take it right off the bat. They're ready to eat. They're ready to start replenishing themselves. And if they're completely deflated, that's not a female that goes, and that's put into a second clutch cycle. But a lot of the times they're, if they go into it healthy enough, they come out of it healthy enough, to run that second time. Eggs, I incubate a lot fancier now than what I used to and than what's needed. I mean, I think that really with a damp paper towel and, putting them in a container and keeping them around 80, you're going to hatch black rat snakes. They're not hard. I use either vermiculite or perlite, kind of that 50-50 mix. I probably go a little bit more than 50% water weight to 50% perlite. I like it just a hair more, or I feel like it's going to dry out over time. Now, as far as the temperature that I incubate at, it's usually about 79, 80 degrees, and that's obviously because I'm using an incubator. But I like to point out to everyone that is incubating snake eggs of really, I don't want to say any type, but most types. Nature does not set itself at 80 degrees. Doesn't work that
Yep.
way. There is natural fluctuations that occur. So as long as you don't have some malfunction that spikes you to 110 degrees or drops you to 60 degrees for an extended period of time, things are probably going to be just fine. If it's a little bit lower than that 80 degrees, they're just going to take longer to incubate. A little bit higher, they're going to hatch sooner. Now, you may end up with deformities. If you incubate black rats at a straight 90 degrees, my guess is some of them are going to come out just fine, but you may experience more kinks, things like that, or dead egg, that type of thing, just because they're typically incubated in the 80-degree mark. And I would say they hatch somewhere between 55 to 65 degrees, 55 to 65 days out from lay. Again, depending on some of those temperature variables.
Well, I mean, anybody that wants to do this now, they have what they need to know.
That's right. Awesome. And if they want some stock, I know a place they can get them. So.
yeah, you might want to go to Bartley Reptiles. Cheap plug. Anyway, so getting babies started, we talked about this a little. That little clutch way back when I was in college, they took pinkies like they were sassy little boogers, and I just basically got them to do that, S strike thing they do, and then they strike the pinky, let go, and they gobbled. Do you do that? Other
I kind of have a series of steps that I take, and really this will be true for most of the snakes that I produce. The first is just throwing a frozen thawed in the container that they're in, because I kind of do a cycle with this, and feeding takes it's about a 6-hour process throughout a day whenever, I've got a bunch of babies, and it's just because of the method, really. So first I'll put a frozen thawed. Then I come back through, and anything that didn't eat frozen thawed, I take those out and I shuffle those to the ones I haven't tried to feed yet that day. And that way I'm not wasting a bunch of my frozen pinkies, right? But frozen thawed in their cage first. If that doesn't work, it's followed by live. And I do that cycle for a few weeks, and normally that gets most everything eating. For the ones that are wanting to play stubborn at that point, my next step is just a deli cup, moving them from whatever tub that they're in to a deli cup and trying the same thing, frozen thawed, trying live. And you'll get a certain percentage that kicks them into gear. If that doesn't work, the next trick is boiled. I boil a pinky for about 30 seconds. And it's amazing how many that kickstarts for some reason. And I think that's because possibly just the smell of the mouse urine on the pinky maybe causes some fear, because an adult rodent could really wreak havoc on a baby snake. Maybe I read that somewhere, and that's why I think it. I don't know. But the boiled pink trick seems to work a lot. And for those who want to try it, I simply bring a pot to boil. However many pinkies you're going to use, drop them in for 30 seconds, no longer than 30 seconds. Pull them out, put them in deli cups, and give them about an hour. If they've not eaten it within an hour, they're not going to. Occasionally, I'll try the braining technique, which is basically cutting a slit in the pinky's skull, exposing the brain. That smell, for some reason, will kick some of them in. And another trick that I'm actually going to attempt to utilize again this week that I've just haven't for a long time, and this is just on a handful that are being stubborn. And by handful, I'm meaning we've produced somewhere around 300 black rat snakes this year. So, we may have like 15 of them that aren't eating. So I'm going to do chicken broth. Just dipping a pinky, and I'll try both frozen thawed, and then I'll try live, as well. But that's another trick that seems to work here and there. At that point, if you've tried all of that and it doesn't work, you can either assist feed, or that animal is just not meant to survive.
To live.
There's going to be some of those that just it's not going to happen. Unfortunately, it's not many, but it does occur.
I don't think enough people realize that everything in a clutch doesn't really need to live.
That's why
you are actually
right.
Yeah, I mean, if if you go to great lengths to get that super stubborn feeder to eat, and then it breeds, there could literally be a genetic basis behind it not wanting to eat. And now you're going to have potentially an entire clutch of critters that have a genetic predisposition to I don't like food, which seems like the most bizarre thing to have a genetic predisposition to, but it happens. You don't know, that gene might be controlling some enzyme that isn't produced, that doesn't trigger a feeding response, or may have elevated levels of cortisol in them associated with. You don't know what the hell's going on. So yeah, no, I'm dealing with that right now, with a couple banded water snake litters that I have. It's really funny. I've got these giant beasts that like suck down the tilapia like it's their job, and there's these withered husks in there, and I've gone to do something controversial, call them, and then I can't. So
Yeah.
so
Well, and like I try to
anyway,
explain to others, I mean, that's why there are that many eggs in a clutch. That's why
exactly.
these have so many babies. They're not in the wild. They wouldn't all survive, and not just because of predators. Some of them would just
Yep.
be too stupid to live. You know what I mean?
Yep.
It's
Yep.
unfortunate. So,
That's amazing.
but yeah, that's it's just going to be the nature of it. So
Cool.
No, it's hard too, especially when you're feeding large numbers of babies. Clint, I think maybe go into how you set up your baby tubs, maybe in terms, just so people aren't thinking you have 1,000 6-quart tubs through your basement or snake room. But I think that might give it a better picture too, just in terms of like how you said, you'll take a frozen thawed pink and put it inside of the enclosure with the animal and things like that.
yeah, if I'm feeding like because I mean my babies are in rack systems, because the last thing I want to do is pop open delis, for hundreds of animals, during feeding if I can avoid that. So they are in rack systems in tubs, and if I'm feeding, let's say, 150 babies, um, I would probably thaw out maybe 90 to 100 pinkies is where I would start. And so I'd go down my rows, and I would mark where the last one was. Everything has an ID card,
Okay.
An index card, so I know exactly. They have their ID number, what they are, what hets they have, whatever. And depending on I've got a whole little way I do it. So it's if the card's straight, then there's nothing in there, meaning there's no food item. If it's turned sideways, just one at the end, that means that's where I stopped with frozen thawed. So I would do that, and I would give them about 45 minutes. And then I would come back down, and one by one, I would check each tub. If they've eaten, mark it down, put the card back. If they've not eaten, I take the frozen thawed out, I put a live in and turn their card sideways. And that tells me there's something in there. Reminds me there's a food item in there. Go back and check that one, right? And so I would go all the way through those first 90 to 100, and most of them would have eaten. But there's always going to be that big set that they only want live. They're not interested in frozen thawed. And I don't really tease feed frozen thawed because there's too many mouths for me to do that with the pinkies, with the babies. So I'll throw that live in. I move the frozen thawed that weren't eaten to the next, group of maybe 30, because maybe I only have 30 pinkies, thawed at that point. And I repeat that cycle all the way through. And that's why it takes a few hours throughout the day. I do it on a weekend, and I'll go do something else for a little bit, come back, and I just keep cycling those all the way through each of the multiple racks of babies that we have. And sometimes if it flows over to the next day to where like, okay, you fed everything, but there's 20 babies that haven't eaten yet because you didn't have enough pinkies thawed out or bring in enough live. Because again, with the size of the collection, I really try to eliminate as much waste as possible. The last thing I want to do is throw away 20 pinkies. I needed them. And so then on Sunday, the following day, I may only have 20 babies to feed, which is nothing, takes no time. But that's usually the day that I'm dealing with the jerks that won't eat either. I'm going to try the extra steps and that kind of thing. So, so it's a process, but it's really, I think for anyone, the best thing you can do for yourself is find your process, what works for you. Because if anybody else went down there, they'd have, I don't even know if they'd realize the index cards being moved a certain way told me something. Because it doesn't just tell me that, it also tells me, let's say that I've pulled frozen thawed out of one, and it's irrelevant for you guys, but just so, give you a chuckle. So upright, slid in vertical, everything's good. If it's turned horizontal and is upright, meaning the side I ride on is facing up, that means there's food in there. If it is upside down, so the side I ride on is face down and is vertical, that means it refused frozen thawed, but I didn't have enough live pinkies, to put one in.
Give it a go.
So as something doesn't eat live, I cycle through and I move them. And then eventually, and also if it is upside down but horizontal, that tells me it has now taken enough meals that I need to take a picture of it and post it for sale. So I just all that in one cycle. And so it just keeps on moving, because otherwise you're having to go back through everything, and it's market, save time, move along. You have to find those little tricks when dealing with a collection the size we are. Because I mean, currently there are over 300 breeders that I'm working with, and right now, just at this moment, there's probably upwards of 300 babies. I think we'll produce a total of probably 500 when it's all said and done by the end of the season. So, have to, and I work full time, so I'm on the road many days a week. So I have to, I keep. There's a few guys that come over and work for me, and they will clean cages while I'm out of town. So when I say I work for a living and I travel, I don't want anyone to think that the animals aren't being cared for. They certainly are. But when it comes to feeding and all that, that's on me. So that's how my Saturdays are spent. So keep good processes in place, and it can make it go a whole lot smoother for you.
I'm just thinking next time I go there, I'm just going to screw around with those note cards.
Oh my God, if you move the cards, he'd be doomed.
I'm just thinking there's going to be a whole lot more snakes I'm sending to Matt to take care of.
No, I didn't know that tidbit, Clint, to be honest, about.
Yeah, it's, with what I do for a living too, there's certain things that are just very process oriented, and finding the best processes make you more efficient, save you more time. And so there's no way I could really operate with a collection that size and not come up with those little tidbits and tricks of, moving things along. So
I love learning about people's little systems like that. I went to the Chair Cowan Desert Museum, Bob Ashley's place, and for a conference, and he has a huge rattlesnake collection, a decent sized rattlesnake collection, and he has a guy that he pays to take care of them. And he was pushing around this Rubbermaid cart. In this cart, you could just tell that he had come up with a system for where everything was on that cart that took him like 25 years or 30 years to perfect. And I talked to him about well, how did you come up with this, and why is everything where it is? Because I just love hearing people's various little, idiosyncratic ways of dealing with the sheer volume, number, and then keeping track of all this stuff. So that's pretty badass that you shared that with everybody. I like that.
No problem. Happy to.
Okay, well, we can quickly move on to Asians if that's cool. We don't have tons of time left, but maybe we can do this in a more detail in a future episode. But let's just talk a little bit about Asians that you keep. So you mentioned the green bush rats, and you obviously have the Porphyracia and the Carinata. Are there any other taxa that you're?
Let's see. Bella Japonesis, so the Chapel rat snakes, Bella rat snakes. Keep those. Mandarins, starting to expand further in that. Keep some of the Exantics. Got those, and I love them. I think that's just a beautiful morph of an Asian species. Taiwan beauties. gotten into
Cool.
really a lot of the beauties now. I would say that would be a side of Asians that I'm expanding into and really wanting to learn a lot more on. Um, Taiwan's blue beauties and Chinese beauties. Right now I've got a pretty decent size order of Chinese beauty morphs coming a little bit later this year, and looking forward to learning them really, because I think that's another species that is kind of mixed around when it comes to morphs that we don't quite have a handle on.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to dabble in that and see what else I can figure out. Also, I work with Koreans. Those are about as spastic a snake as you can find, but they're pretty.
Phenomenal.
So,
so let's talk about Koreans real quick,
Sure.
because I tried for the longest time during my Asian phase to just get a flipping. In fact, I think I messaged you. Now that I'm thinking about it, just a normal Korean rat snake.
Yep.
No morph, no nothing, just a normal. And I won't name names, but I bought one off of Morph Market, and the guy sent me it, and it was the most perfect Russian rat snake I've ever
pulled. You got a Russian, didn't you?
And then I got in an argument, was like, this is not a Korean, and then I ultimately did get my money back. But do you know where you can find those? Because that is definitely, and I know there's an albino, I believe. I'm talking about normals.
Yeah.
Or hets even.
Yeah, you can find a pair of them in my basement. As a matter of fact.
All right, well, we'll produce them.
Yeah, I've got a pair of normals, and I've got a trio of albinos, and I'd had adults. These are all the normals will probably be able to go next year. The albinos, I'll probably give them another year. I just held back some babies and working with them. But I agree, the normals were not easy to find. I forget exactly where I got them, but I believe we found them on a wholesale list, and they turned out they are Koreans. At least they look like it so far.
Gotcha.
So pretty happy on that find, because to your point, yeah, they are incredibly difficult to come up with. So.
And to stay on the black rat point, they are the ecological equivalent to our black rats in Asia. They're at the exact same latitude as ours. So,
as a matter of fact, I was going to say, I've had great success with my Koreans keeping them like I keep my North Americans. I keep them a little bit warmer.
Yeah.
I don't need to keep the humidity. You keep them like you do a North American rat snake, and they produce and do pretty well. The warmer you get them, the more spastic they are. So.
So I always love to compare snakes that kind of fill a similar niche, but come from different places. So, and I've kept beauties before, Taiwans and blues, and I know Matt has them. What all species do you have currently, Matt? I know you have Chinese, right?
Chinese, Ridley Eye.
Forgot, got that too. Yeah.
That's really it for the beauties at this point in time.
Okay.
Space concerns.
They get big.
Yeah.
We're actually building an exhibit here at West Liberty right now that's going to house an 8-foot monster Taiwan beauty snake that's going through quarantine in my garage. But any differences in care that you've noticed? I mean, I noticed some, but you're our guest, so same deal.
As far as the beauties.
Yes. From black rats or North American rats, whatever we want to call them.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to like the Asians and the beauties, I would say that I'm still learning myself on them. The way I currently have them housed is I would say I have more humidity on them than what I have on the North Americans. But I don't fully know if they need it. I still go back to if as long as they have this humid hide, I think that suffices for a lot of their humidity needs. But I also, keeping in mind that they are in a basement, basement area. So it's more humid down there than what, the general air conditioning is going to be throughout the rest of the house or even the area. But at the same time, I'll say that it's not the most humid basement. We're running probably about 45% humidity. down there. So it's not Matt's place by any means. Um, I do have, when I say I've got them a little more humid, I keep them on cypress mulch, where I keep my North
Okay.
Americans on aspen. And I do that really because the aspen, in my experience, is just easier to spot clean than what cypress mulch is.
Mhm.
So I use it where I can. But the Asians right now, with the exception of the Koreans, I put them on cypress. I'm sorry, I put them on aspen, and they're just fine. The beauties, and it's funny that we're having this conversation on it because sometimes I just go off some pictures I see because it tells me how other keepers are keeping theirs. And so I've seen several that are keeping beauties on aspen, and I'm like, bet it's okay. I bet it's all right
Mhm.
if just so long as again they're provided with a humid area, if nothing else. And in fact, the Carinata I have now pulled off of cypress mulch to put back on aspen because I don't know if that's one of the things that are causing some of these to not breed. And I'm noticing with a snake that's that size, um, just some of the discoloration on the belly a little
Yeah.
bit. Maybe that they were getting too wet in some of these areas when they would move around and get the bedding spread out, so they're getting deeper in it to where it's in a cage that has cypress mulch. The most humid mulch is at the bottom because that's where everything's went. And so I just little things like that trying to figure out. And I know that the Carinata produced better when they were on aspen. And I don't know if maybe the kind of the keeled scales that they have versus a lot of the others, maybe they don't need as much humidity. It's me guessing,
Mhm.
right? There's really not a pamphlet on them yet, that says this is the winning recipe on
Yeah. There you
Carinata
go.
breeding. So, um, but yeah, like I said, beauties are something new to me. I don't think they're a difficult species to keep so far. I see several people with them, but this was my first year producing Chinese beauties. Had a little surprise, bred two that I thought were hypos together and got all green babies. So yeah,
Hmm.
I think that I'm dealing with a T negative and T positive, or a T negative and a hypo, or even two different T negative strains. But obviously,
Yeah.
there's two different strains I'm working with these particular animals. So lots to uncover, and I'm looking forward to the day of having to fight a mean 12-foot blue beauty. We'll see how that goes. But right now, the
Yeah.
Ridley eye keep me on my toes. So
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. Getting rid of my blue beauties was hard. That was because I raised those puppies from little. They were in a deli cup, and my largest female was pushing 8.5, 9 feet. One of the things that I found absolutely fascinating about those animals is when you look at them and they're all coiled up in their enclosure, there's your brain does not comprehend that animal is eight. I mean, it's bigger, it's longer than the false water cobras, which when I look at those, like I know those are big, but these guys, it was just kind of cool how they are able to hide their overall length very effectively.
yeah,
It's pretty fascinating.
the same thing with the Ridley eye, especially because
Hmm.
they're skinnier snakes, so you don't really.
Yeah.
It's hard to see that. I mean, like the Carinata, I've got some big Carinata as well. We're probably talking pushing eight
Yep.
feet, and um, they're such a heavy bodied snake.
Yep.
Too with that you see you've got a big snake there. I remember
Hmm.
pulling out that tub. I think it was Brandon Osborne who was over, and when I pulled one of these tubs out with a adult Carinata female in it. It's holy, because it looks like you've got. I mean, it's bigger than a bull snake, and that's it's what you're kind of comparing a lot of that to. So, yeah, and even then, even those big ones, you don't fully appreciate the length they've got on them until they're darting off away from you, and you're
Yes.
trying to
Yep.
catch them. And with some of these aggressives, you're hooking them at the same time, so you're not taking a thump from a snake that size if you can
Hmm.
avoid it. And um, you also forget when it comes to something like a Carinata how powerful those animals really
Yeah.
are, and fast. and fat.
Mhm.
So you're dealing with an aggressive, strong, big, fast animal. They're not for beginners, people. It's
Yeah.
not a beginner species at all.
It sounds like I need to get a dozen of them because you just like listed off
Incidentally,
all my
that's about
favorite
how
things.
many I've got.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Cool. Well, we're nearing the 2 hour mark. And final question: what's the future for Bartley Reptiles? Are there any Colubrid groups that you haven't dabbled with that you'd like to give a go, or are you happy with where you're at now, or just kind of spitball on that for a little bit so people know?
I am the kind of individual that is never content. That it's difficult for
Okay.
me. It's always pushing forward, bigger expansion. Greater thoughts. It's That's just my nature. And I would
Hmm.
say that as far as colubrids go, obviously beauties are the project I'm on right now. Like that's the addition. That's
Hmm.
the segment that I'm growing the collection numbers in this year significantly. Going forward, I really don't mess with any of the pits
Hmm.
as of right now. So gophers, bulls, I don't have any of those, and those may be on the horizon at some point. I say that, however, there are so many Asian species out there that I don't work with now. And not only are they out there and available, but there's so many species that I think still need to be established in the hobby. And
Hmm.
that's conversations that Matt and I have, regularly, that whether established in the hobby or established in the United States hobby, they're just not
Gotcha.
here yet. So I would say that would be the things to be on the lookout for from Bartley Reptiles in the future would be additional Asian species that you're not seeing yet, for sure. That's every year we'll probably attempt to add at least one species to the docket, on what we're working with, which puts us about 2 or 3 years out from potentially producing them if we're lucky, right? So,
Hmm.
and that will be again with great help from Matt here because of his phenomenal connections overseas, his
Hmm.
incredible expertise, on a lot of these Asian species to help get your hands on them and then hopefully keep them alive,
Hmm.
whenever you do have them.
Yes.
So that would be it. I would say, if anything, pits and more Asian species coming down the pipeline.
Yeah. Pits are very dangerous. Very, very, very dangerous.
I say pits because I have
Oh,
a difficult time
yeah.
saying the actual Latin names of all these
Yeah.
critters because it's the
Hmm.
hillbilly. It's hard enough to speak English. Okay.
Yes. Yep. Well, you're talking to a hillbilly because I
I
born and
get
raised in
it,
West
but you're
Virginia.
a very
So,
educated hillbilly.
hmm,
So
yes, that's right. There's educated hillbilly that exists. Um, yeah.
For those listening, for pits that are interested in rat snakes, you really should go down the ladder rat snake keeping skill, because from my perspective, that's the European Pituophis.
Ugh,
Just
why did you say that? I gotta get those. Okay, man, I've looked at those for years, Matt. Yeah, I could see that.
well, I
Very,
mean,
very cool.
even just their body shape,
Hmm.
everything, but their personalities represent 100% pit.
Mm,
the latitude,
very
of course.
cool. Hmm.
Oh yeah.
All righty. Well, on that note, we're at 2 hours. So thank you, Clint. This was freaking phenomenal. And you get the dubious honor of being our first guest. So that's pretty awesome.
And it is an honor. I hope you guys know that when you first message and ask, I mean, as I said, I think that was my response. I would be honored because absolutely, I think it's so exciting that the two of you are partnering up and doing this. It's obviously a segment of the hobby that is near and dear to me, and I
Mhm.
think that it's it's near and dear to a lot of people, and it's coming back with a vengeance. I mean,
Yes.
the popularity of colubrids as a whole is exploding again, and for there to be a resource like this to come and learn, from those who are out there doing it, and it couldn't be coming from two better guys. So I'm excited to see where this goes.
Oh.
Thank you so much for having me. I really do appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks, Clint.
Mm-hmm. So that's our second episode. Any final thoughts, Matt, before we wrap this up?
No, I'm really excited how this is continuing on, and have a number of great guests lined up, as Zach and I have been conversing with those people, and we're really, if you want some specific animal or topic to be brought up in a future episode, don't hesitate to contact Zach or myself, as we are very open to this, and we want everyone to have a platform for learning. And what better source than to learn from our fellow keepers that have a positive aspect in this industry too as well.
Yes, absolutely. And soon, if Matt and I's lives would just calm down a little bit, there will be a Facebook page and an Instagram page and whatever other platform we need to make a page on for the podcast where you'll be able to go. So whenever that happens, it'll show up in both of our respective social media outlets. And obviously we'll be talking about it. And, we'll close this thing out. We are part of the NPR network, and we're proud to be a part of that network. And thank you to Eric once again for giving us this opportunity. Check it out. We got a website for NPR network. You can see all the other podcasts. I said last time I would be able to rattle them all off. I lied. I can't do that. There's one on, obviously, there's Morelia Python Radio, the Australian Herpetoculture podcast. There's Reptile Fight Club, the most recent episode of that with Casey Cannon, and Lizard Brain Radio, and drawing a blank because it's late. Sorry very much for that. But about the Invisible Ark, that was a phenomenal podcast. Go listen to that. Carpets and Coffee, and then all the other podcasts that they have that I didn't mention, and I'm sorry we didn't mention them. We'll mention them next time. But with that, you know where to find us. Look us up on social media. Reach out. The people that have reached out, thank you, and the people that want to reach out, do it. We're asking you to, because that's the only way that we make sure that we produce what you want. So with that, thank you for listening to the second episode of Colubrid and Colubroid Radio. Good night. Happy day, whatever time it is. See ya.